The Atlanta Hawks season is essentially over. Barring some kind of crazy run through the play-in tournament, their focus is now on the offseason and on next season. It's a very interesting team because I think there's going to be some significant changes for the Hawks this offseason. Now, one of the things I find most interesting about Atlanta is the roster itself is actually pretty good, and it feels like a team that should be better than they are, but they constantly find themselves kind of in this middle ground, right? Where they're not quite contenders, yet they're not quite bad enough to be one of the worst teams in the entire league. And anytime you are in that position and you're a team in Atlanta that has invested draft capital in improving this team over the years, most namely with the DeJounte Murray trade, it puts you in a position where you really have to evaluate how good you can actually be, what your actual ceiling is. And in Atlanta's case, they've tried with different versions of the roster, they've tried with different coaches, and they just haven't been able to figure out the right combination. And that's a difficult spot to be in, right? Because the roster seems decent. You have star power in Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, and you have at least some history of recent success. I mean, they made the conference finals not too long ago, but you have to really evaluate how much that conference finals run actually meant and how replicable that is in the future with this roster as you continue to age and maybe change some pieces around as the roster continues to get more expensive. And the critical point here too is that Atlanta has tried a lot of different stuff. It's not as if they've had the same coach the entire time. It's not as if they've had the exact same roster the entire time. They've tried to change things, and I think they have one of the better coaches in the East now in Quinn Snyder, and he still has not been able to figure out a way to put this team truly together in a way that makes sense. And as you look at their roster moving forward, it is a group that should make sense. I like Jalen Johnson. Trae Young is obviously very good. DeJounte Murray, Clint Capella, and Yucca Kongwu, they have some decent wings. Bogdanovich is still really good as well. And for whatever reason, it's just not working. Whenever that happens, it makes me wonder, okay, is this a break it down kind of situation? And I think any conversation that you have about Atlanta changing things up with their roster in a significant way begins with both of the guards. I am at the point now where I would be very surprised if Atlanta goes into next season and starts the year with both DeJounte Murray and Trae Young on the same team. I don't know that they're going to trade both of them. I don't know which of the guards they're going to trade, but it feels like a situation that needs to be resolved, and one that they tried to resolve, quite frankly, in the middle of the year, and they just didn't end up getting offers that they liked. But one thing that benefits Atlanta with this particular offseason, if they did want to try and move either Trae Young or DeJounte Murray, is that the market for available free agents and significant upgrades in the offseason is pretty limited. If you're one of these contending or semi-contending teams that would be looking to bring in either Murray or Trae Young, your options out there in free agency aren't great. And in terms of available stars, those options aren't really out there either. And so if Atlanta does decide to make a move and split up their backcourt, they kind of have a leg up on some of these other teams because one of those guys could be one of the more sought after players in the offseason, which I think is one of the reasons why they didn't trade one of them at the deadline, because there's just going to be more opportunity for them to get a better deal potentially in the offseason. The guy I want to start with actually is DeJounte Murray, because he to me is really interesting as a piece to an actual contender. I think the fit of DeJounte Murray in certain situations is really, really intriguing. The Lakers were a team that was mentioned in the middle of the year. Supposedly they were willing to offer at least a first round pick in exchange for DeJounte Murray, but D'Angelo Russell started playing better. They couldn't really find a fit for D'Lo to go to a third team. Murray in LA with the Lakers does make a lot of sense as that kind of creator and two-way player. His defense has certainly fallen off, at times in Atlanta, but I think he could get back to that potentially alongside LeBron and AD with the Lakers. And again, they have assets as well that I think Atlanta could be interested in. I think the Sixers are also a really, really interesting DeJounte Murray possibility because they're going to have cap space this offseason to maybe be able to, sign some guys, bring in maybe someone like DeMar DeRozan or bring in, maybe they could try and go for LeBron, whatever the case may be. And then they still have some assets to potentially go out and get DeJounte Murray if they wanted and potentially add two stars in an offseason in which there's not really multiple free agent guys that they could realistically go out and get with the amount of cap space that they have. They're going to have a ton of cap space, but there's just not, this isn't the summer of 2019 where there's a ton of big time free agents, and Philadelphia clearly wants to add talent. And I think the possibility of them adding one piece in free agency and then trading for DeJounte Murray, pairing him alongside Tyrese Maxey, to me is really interesting. And even though the Murray-Trae Young combination in Atlanta hasn't really worked in terms of Murray being like a complementary guard, I'm not completely writing off that possibility in a certain situation, and I think Philadelphia could be really, really interesting for him. You could also go to some other teams like Sacramento that need a kind of defensive-minded guard alongside De'Aaron Fox. Again, maybe there's some of the similar issues there with Trae Young that you had in Atlanta, but that's an interesting possibility. Even Golden State, I think, is incredibly interesting if they decide to let Klay Thompson walk. Maybe there's some kind of deal you could work out there with Philadelphia, and there's like a three-way trade. Obviously, it would have to be a sign-and trade, which makes things complicated. But I think DeJounte Murray in Golden State is extremely interesting considering some of the assets that they have as well. And the more I look at the DeJounte Murray trade market, the more intrigued I am by just the number of different teams he could go to and the possibilities of what he could do on those new teams, because I still think he's really talented. I think his skill set is really interesting. And if he can figure out a backcourt partner that he fits really well with and better with than he did with Trae Young in Atlanta, that would be really cool and interesting to me. It would be more difficult to convince me that it's a good idea if it's a team team like Orlando, for example, where it's like, if DeJounte Murray is one of my like main, I guess in this case, he would be the primary perimeter player. I've said that Paolo and Franz, but I'm saying like the point guard of my team. I don't love the ceiling of that. Like if he is the guy, but if he goes somewhere like Philly alongside Tyrese Maxey or Golden State alongside Steph or Sacramento alongside De'Aaron Fox, I like that team comp for him much better, as long as, you know, there's a way to be able to share the kind of opportunities that those guys would need to share together in the backcourt. But speaking of teams that maybe need a primary guy, I think the Trae Young market is also incredibly interesting. The Lakers are always going to be involved in things like this. Anytime they have an opportunity to bring in a player as talented as Trae Young, that's an opportunity that they're definitely going to take a look at. San Antonio has been rumored as well. They have a ton of assets they could trade if they want to try and pair Trae Young and Victor Wembanyama together. The Pelicans are also extremely interesting because they've obviously brought in CJ McCollum in the past to try and add some firepower in their backcourt, and Trae Young kind of represents a similar level of an upgrade there. And I think the most interesting thing for Atlanta in terms of their future and what they're trying to build is that the opportunities for a good trade with either DeJounte Murray or Trae Young are much stronger in the offseason here coming up than they were at the deadline. And it makes a lot of sense that they did hold on to both of these guys. They're both under long-term contracts. They're both going to have some value. And I do think that it makes a lot of sense for them to, even if they don't make the move, at least really, really explore trading either DeJounte Murray or Trae Young, because there's a couple of other interesting pieces on the team that I think could be pieces to the future, like Jalen Johnson, like Onyeka Okongwu, and then they could get a ton of assets for, you know, Clint Capella, Bogdanovich, Trae Young, DeJounte Murray. They could trade all those guys if they really wanted to. And I think it's clear that it's time for a reset and a rebuild in Atlanta. If you want to try and build that around Trae Young and you're still a Trae Young believer, that's fine. But if you're someone like me that has kind of seen them go through different versions of this team around Trae Young and it's just never really worked, this feels like a kind of reset offseason for Atlanta, a team that's constantly going to be involved in discussions with a lot of guys that I truly think contenders are definitely going to want and possibly try and make a move for. And to me, the worst thing that could happen if you're a Hawks fan this offseason is if they just don't really do anything. If they just, you know, sign a guy with the mid-level exception and then, you know, make a draft pick or whatever, and then just kind of move forward in the next year with the same team, because that shows a team, in my opinion, that doesn't really have a clear direction, that doesn't really know where they want to go, how they want to continue to improve, how they want to kind of get to that point of being a contender. And that would be a real concern for me personally if I was a Hawks fan, of like, okay, clearly this is a roster that doesn't really work super well together. It's, yes, we deal with injury issues, but the entire league deals with injury stuff, and they just have not been able to figure it out since that run of the conference finals. And I would certainly be concerned about a team that looks at the situation and looks at the season they just had and thinks that it's okay to just run it back, specifically with that backcourt tandem. If they go into next year with both those guys together in the backcourt, I'd be very surprised. It just doesn't work. They're not even really like a compliment to each other in any way. It's just, okay, it's a DeJounte Murray possession now, and now it's a Trae Young possession. And they're both individually extremely talented, but I think clearly not only the roster itself, but the backcourt, the combination of those two guys, there needs to be some changes in Atlanta this offseason.